Good evening, everyone. My name is Dan Schwartz from Shipman and Goodwin and chair of the Connecticut Bar Foundation James W. Cooper Fellows Program. I want to welcome you to the inaugural event of the Constance Baker Motley Speaker Series on Racial Inequality, co-sponsored by the Connecticut Bar Foundation and the Connecticut Bar Association. I'm fairly certain you've never attended a program quite like this before, but we're honored to have you from wherever you are. We know in these challenging times that these are, we hope you are staying safe and well. First, a few housekeeping matters. Tonight's program is via a webinar format, so there will not be an opportunity for open discussion with the audience. However, in the upcoming months, we will be producing a series of additional programs and roundtable discussions where you will have the opportunity to discuss racial inequality as it relates to various aspects of society. For tonight, please feel free to pose a question in the chat. I would warn you, with literally hundreds of you attending, we won't be able to cover everything, but we will incorporate it into planning for later events. We've had our moderators cull through the many questions that were already submitted, so hopefully we can cover a lot of ground tonight. In the midst of this pandemic, the protests that have struck a chord with so many of us have once again brought the issues of racial injustice to the forefront of the nation's conversations. But why us? Why lawyers? And why now? One need only look at the preamble of our rules of professional conduct for the answer. It's in the very first words, and they are as follows. A lawyer, as a member of the legal profession, is a representative of clients, an officer of the legal system, and a public citizen having special responsibility for the quality of justice. Thus, as leaders of the profession, we think the time is right to invite discussion, to reflect on those discussions, and to take action now on the issue of racial injustice. A system of justice that does not provide justice for all is not a system that any of us should tolerate. This series will provide an ongoing forum to talk about racial inequality and systemic racism by drawing on knowledgeable speakers on a variety of topics. A preview of the anticipated topics will be presented at the end of tonight's program. We hope you can stick around for that. The series will also address underlying issues that provide impediments to eliminating racism so that our nation and our state can fulfill their promises. I'm now honored to introduce our featured speakers for this evening, Chief Justice Richard Robinson and Justice Maria Khan of the Connecticut Supreme Court. The Honorable Richard Robinson was first appointed as a judge of the Connecticut Superior Court in 2000 after serving the city of Stamford since 1985, first as staff counsel and then as assistant corporation counsel until his appointment to the bench. During those years, he also found the time to serve as a commissioner of the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities and as general counsel for the Connecticut Conference of the NAACP. He was elevated to the appellate court in 2007, the Supreme Court in 2013, and then as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 2018. His extensive community and professional activities, frankly, are far too numerous to list here, but I want to mention and highlight just a few. He has been the recipient of the Ebony Magazine Power 100 Award, the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities Alvin W. Penn Award for Excellence in Leadership, and the Quinnipiac School of Law Black Student Association Thurgood Marshall Award. We're honored to have Justice Robinson with us today. The Honorable Maria Khan emigrated to the United States at the age of 10, having grown up in Angola, Africa. Prior to her services as a judge, she served as an assistant U.S. attorney in New Haven, where she was responsible for complex white-collar investigations and prosecutions. She was first appointed to the bench in 2006 to serve as a judge of the Superior Court and was later elevated to the Appellate Court and then the Supreme Court in 2017. She has been an honored recipient of many awards and recognitions as well, including the Department of Justice Special Achievement Award, the Department of Health and Human Services OIG Integrity Award, and the Americo Ventura Lifetime Achievement Award from the Portuguese Bar Association. Again, we're honored to have Justice Khan with us. As chair of the fellows, I'm also proud to say that they are both James W. Cooper Life Fellows. Before I turn it over to Amy Lynn Meyerson, who is president of the Connecticut Bar Association, I also want to publicly thank members of our steering committee who have worked night and day the last few weeks to pull this together in a timely way. It's not easy in normal times, and certainly in the midst of this pandemic, it is a monumental task. Many, many, many thanks as well to the staffs of the CBA and the CBS, and in particular, Natalie Wagner and Keith Soresi for providing invaluable staff support and guidance. And with that, let me turn it over to Amy for a few more introductory remarks.
Dan, good evening. I echo Dan's comments and thank all of you for your courage and for taking the time to engage with us in this conversation that will have moments of discomfort. As president of the Connecticut Bar Association, a CBF fellow, and a past Connecticut Bar Foundation board member, I'm pleased that the Connecticut Bar Association and the Connecticut Bar Foundation are working in collaboration to present this speaker series in reaffirming support for our justice system and our joint commitment to advancing diversity, equality, and inclusion. These discussions lay the groundwork, including examining counter-narratives and the different causes of racial versus socioeconomic disparities that will allow us to be forward-looking in our solutions. Racial bias and discrimination hold all of us back. Later in the program, we will hear more from Cecil Thomas, CBA President-elect and one of the co-chairs of the CBA Diversity and Inclusion Committee, about upcoming programming in this speaker series addressing the systemic obstacles to equal opportunity and equal justice. It is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed moderators for this evening's program. Marilyn Ward Ford is the Neil Cogan Public Service Professor of Law at the Quinnipiac University School of Law. A faculty member since 1979, she teaches courses in securities regulation, business organizations, corporate finance, and Native American law. Her areas of research include civil rights, Native American land claim issues, and corporate law. Before joining the School of Law, she worked as an attorney with a Wall Street law firm, a human rights organization, and a Fortune Global 500 energy company. At the School of Law, among other things, she advises the Black Law Students Association, the Native American Law Students Association, and the Women's Law Society. Dr. Ford has served as secretary of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, whose first president was Martin Luther King Jr. She's the 2016 CBA Tapping Reeve Legal Educator Award recipient. Timothy Fisher is the 17th Dean of the University of Connecticut School of Law. He spent 35 years in private practice with a long history of public service before joining UConn Law as its dean. He received the 2008 John Eldridge Shields Distinguished Professional Service Award and was the president of the Connecticut Bar Foundation from 2010 to 2013. He served on the Governor's Commission on Judicial Reform, as well as on numerous other judicial, legislative task force, and commissions. Dean Fisher is the founder of the Connecticut Innocence Fund, a first-in-the-nation program to assist exonerees to re-enter society when released from prison after proof of their innocence. Welcome, Dr. Ford. I turn the conversation over into your skilled hands.
Thank you so much. So let me start by saying that this series is appropriately named. Constance Baker Motley is the epitome of the conversations that will take place in this series about systemic and structural racism, criminal justice, education, healthcare, housing, voter suppression, political equality, and employment. I am really honored to be one of the moderators of the inaugural event. That's because, among other things, I had the privilege and the pleasure of actually meeting Judge Constance Baker Motley early in my career. I met her through my friendship with her niece, Constance Royster, to meet Connie. And on many occasions, Connie invited my husband, my children, and I to her home, where we enjoyed good food and the opportunity to interact with Judge Motley. We also had the opportunity to visit with Judge Motley at her home in Chester, Connecticut, where we were able to look through photo albums with Judge Motley and listen to her talk to us about all of the people that she had represented and all of the cases that she had worked on during the civil rights movement. We also had the opportunity to sit with Mr. Motley by his pond. And let me just stop a second. We talk about Judge Motley tonight, but Mr. Motley was an attorney and a real estate professional, an extremely accomplished individual in his own right. He was a man ahead of his time, and he wanted and valued his wife's work, and he fully supported her in all of it. In fact, without his support, she may not have been able to accomplish all that she did. So what were some of the things that this remarkable woman did? Judge Motley, a remarkable woman, a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a litigator, an elected official, and a judge. She was elegant, she was graceful, she was definitely outspoken and courageous. She was strategic, she was a visionary, she was tough, she was determined. She was a formidable opponent who overcame gender and racial constraints in her lived experiences and in career. She was born in New Haven, Connecticut. Her parents were immigrants from Nevis, British West Indies. After she graduated from high school in New Haven, she wanted to attend a historically Black college. And I bring this up because this helps us to understand how she made some of her early decisions. While riding to Fisk University in the South, she boarded her train in New York City, where she sat in an integrated car. At the appropriate time near the Mason-Dixon line, she was ungraciously evicted from her seat in the integrated car and forced to ride in the dilapidated colored car that was put on the train. This experience influenced her determination to become a lawyer and fight for equal justice under law for all, which, by the way, is the title of her autobiography, which you have not read. You should get a copy of it. So this precocious, outspoken young woman from the North was definitely not well suited to the Jim Crow South. She transferred from the school in the South. She then entered New York University. She ultimately became a student at Columbia University, where she graduated. She then was hired by Thurgood Marshall as the first woman attorney at the Legal Defense Fund, and also the only woman at the Legal Defense Fund, and the only woman attorney to argue cases in the dangerous South during the period from 1946 to 1964. Almost all of the cases that were decided and argued to desegregate schools, colleges, universities, housing, transportation, lunch counters, museums, libraries, parks, and pretty much all public places of accommodation, they were argued by Constance Baker Motley. She was trial or appellate counsel in over 200 cases, 57 cases in the Supreme Court, 82 in federal courts of appeals, 48 in federal district courts, and tons of cases in state courts. She represented protesters who sat in at white-only restaurants and lunch counters, and she won the case in the United States Supreme Court, which set aside all of their convictions. She represented freedom riders who were jailed when they rode across the country on buses to test the Supreme Court decision that prohibited segregation in interstate transportation, and she won the case in the Supreme Court that set aside their convictions too. She secured the right for Blacks to register to vote, to serve on juries, to ride and sit in any vacant seat on buses and trains, to use white-only bathrooms, to drink from white-only water fountains, to stay in hotels that were only available for whites, and to basically enjoy all public accommodations on an equal basis with whites. She won cases against the states of Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas, Georgia, Tennessee, North and South Carolina, Ohio, New Jersey, New York, and the District of Columbia. And she secured the rights for Blacks to attend formerly all-white public schools, colleges, and universities. Yes, those of us who have become professionals, we owe an awful lot to Judge Motley. She represented Dr. Martin Luther King, and I'm going to bring this up because many people don't understand the importance of what she did for Dr. Martin Luther King. When he led the Birmingham movement, school children, thousands of school children had been expelled for demonstrating with him. Their parents were outraged. If the children had not gotten back in school, it's possible that the civil rights movement would not have moved forward, and definitely that Dr. King would not have been elevated the position that he had in the movement. She actually won the case that got all of the children back into school. So when you see on the TV, those children being attacked by vicious dogs, being beat by police, being hosed by fire department hoses, think about the work that Justice that Judge Constance Baker Motley did on behalf of the civil rights movement. She endured physical threats, encountered hostile mobs. In Mississippi and Alabama, Black men with guns had to meet her at the airport, had to escort her back and forth to court, and they had to surround the house that she lived in at night to protect her. She transitioned from the Legal Defense Fund to political life. She became the first Black woman to serve in the New York Senate, first woman to sit on the New York Board of Estimate, and the first woman elected as the New York Borough President. President Johnson nominated her to serve as a judge in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. And after episodes of gender discrimination, political theater, and a fight which she came prepared to win and won, she became the first woman judge in the Southern District of New York and the first Black woman federal judge in the entire country. 4 decades on that court, she decided more than 2,500 cases that had broad and extensive rulings. She declined the opportunity to have the court building at 500 Pearl Street named in her honor, but she did agree to have the jury assembly room named after her. So if any of you, and especially the lawyers who are watching this, if you were ever in the court, please stop by and see the beautiful photo of Judge Motley that her clerks hung in the Constance Baker Motley jury room. And if you're ever in Chester, Connecticut, please stop by and visit the Constance Baker Motley exhibit at the Chester Historical Society. And while you're in Chester, please stop by and visit the Motley Chester Preserve. The home owned by Constance Baker Motley and her husband Joel on Cedar Lake Road is now a historic site on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. The state designation of this home for the Freedom Trail puts it among the very few select sites that celebrate extraordinary individuals whose lives expanded the circle of freedom and equality and opportunity for all Americans. That is Constance Baker Motley. Now I have the distinct pleasure of being able to introduce the son of Constance Baker Motley, and that's Joel Motley III. Joel graduated magna cum laude from Harvard College. He earned his JD from Harvard Law, and he practiced corporate law at Simpson, Thacher, and Bartlett for a period of time before he began his career in investment banking at Lazard Farris. And he also served as Senator Patrick Moynihan's chief of staff for the New York City and surrounding counties. Currently, Joel is an independent director of Invesco Mutual Funds and an independent director of the Office of Finance of the Federal Home Loan Bank System, a member council on foreign relations and chairman emeritus of the board of Human Rights Watch. He serves on the boards of the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, the Historic Hudson Valley, and the Greenwald Foundation. And in the Motley family, the fruit doesn't fall far from the tree. Similar to his parents, Joel is not only a talented, but a multi-talented individual. So with all the other things that he has done, he had time to produce the award-winning documentary, The Trials of Constance Baker Motley. Joel showed that documentary about his mother to the Connecticut Judges Institute last year. It is my distinct pleasure to now turn this over to Joel Motley III.
Marilyn, thank you for that really lovely introduction. I think it's one of the finest introductions of my mother that I've ever heard. I think that my mother would certainly want me to say to this group how proud she was to be from Connecticut. And as she did her work in the South that Marilyn described, that pride in Connecticut and the New England values that Connecticut embodies really became more and more dear to her as she had to work so hard in other parts of the country that didn't have those values. This speaker series, which has come out of an incredible explosion, not unlike the explosion we had in the early 1960s, I think captures the spirit of my mother's work. And I think it's a particularly fine way to carry on her legacy. I look forward to this discussion today and to the speaker series that will come after it. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Motley, for allowing us to take advantage of the amazing story of your mother portrayed to us so well by Professor Ford. Thank you, Professor Ford. That was a remarkable review of the incredible story and the incredible life of Judge Motley, and such an apt way for us to understand the importance of what we're doing tonight. Professor Ford and I are going to pose a series of questions to Chief Justice Richard Robinson and Justice Maria Khan. We did invite all of you who are attendees this evening to offer questions and comments to us to include, and we really appreciate the rich array of suggestions you gave us. A number of them were similar, and we have sought to blend those into some of the questions you'll hear tonight. But even still, we couldn't include all of them, and so we apologize for that. But we're really happy that this is the first of a series of conversations, and so there will be many more opportunities to explore the really crucial issues that we're going to be addressing this evening. And so with that, I'm pleased to lead off the questions, and the first one is posed to both Chief Justice Robinson and Justice Khan, and it is the following. Why do you think it's important for this conversation about racial justice and implicit bias to take place at this point in time?
I'll take that, Dean Fisher. Let me start. I'm going to talk about this now, but I'm going to start out talking about 2003 first. 2003, I became one of the educators at Connecticut's Judicial College. We call it the Connecticut Judges Institute. I joined it back then, and one of the first things that the Chief Justice asked me to do was to talk about bias and how it affected our judicial system. So even then, it was an issue for the Connecticut judges. But now there's something really different about what's going on. It was important then and it's important now. But I think we're at the perfect time to start having these really difficult conversations about race. Those are incredibly difficult conversations. I can remember having the same kinds of conversations around my kitchen table. I was very lucky to have a mother and father who were very active in talking about rights and civil rights and things of that nature. Now, mom's Black, dad identified Black as Black also. So why would it be difficult for a Black family to talk about race? Well, my dad believed more of H. Rap Brown's kind of approach to trying to achieve equal rights. And my mother was a follower of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So those conversations were just excellent. They were very good debaters, and we were always allowed to be a part of that debate. One time, I can remember Jackie Robinson was speaking at West Main Street Community Center, and there was a Black Panther rally. And at the same time, there was an Up With the People rally. I don't know if you remember that organization. They used to go around the United States. And so I told Mom that I was going to the Up With the People rally. I told Dad I was going to the Black Panther rally. And I did both. But these conversations are not easy to have. They're extremely difficult to have, but they must be had. I have difficult conversations with all my crucial relationships, whether it's my marriage, whether it's with my children, whether it's with my friends. And I really think that the value of that relationship requires me to have those difficult conversations when I do. When it comes to race, I wonder if most people are willing to have those kinds of conversations, because it needs to happen now. You know, people have been killed before George Floyd. People have been killed, throughout history. And in the American history, there was lynchings, there was a killing of civil rights leaders, and these kind of conversations didn't happen. You just sort of get excited about what's happening at the moment, then you go on and nothing would happen, and then it would happen again. This is one of the first times in my life that I'm actually seeing people from all corners, including police chiefs, including congressmen, including people on the street saying, we need to do something about that. So those conversations we were having when I was a kid are more important for all of us to have now. The thing is, are we willing to have those discussions? And I'm not talking about debates. Those are totally different things. I'm talking about letting your guard down and letting a person speak to you from the heart about what they feel. Now, that requires something from both sides. It requires courage on both sides. The conversations aren't easy. I've had conversations where it's been very difficult. During trainings, and Justice Khan can verify this, we had done an implicit bias training, and there was a young man who came up to us, and he really didn't believe in anything that we were doing with the training. He said, there's no problem with race. look at it. You're the Chief Justice, you know. And I immediately thought back, oh, this is the President Obama was elected, so we're now in post-racial America position. And I wanted to go after him, but that wouldn't have done any good. So we sat back, and Justice Conrad, we started talking to him, asking him questions and saying, well, what do you feel about this? And he would ask us a question. Before long, we were like talking to each other for, it had to be 30 minutes to a half an hour in this circle with us, some students from the place where we were doing the training. And we actually, I think, were able to move the ball forward because we all fell into this condition. We were all talking. We were all accepting ideas that, not necessarily accepting ideas, but accepting speech that we didn't like, we didn't agree with. We were able to do that. Now is the time we need to do more of that. We need to make sure that the issues are fleshed out and open, and that people start to understand one another's position. Until we do that, we're going to go back to our respective corners and wait until the next round. And I think that is something we should not do.
Justice Khan, do you also want to comment on that question? Because if not, I have another question that I would like to ask.
I would just add that I, of course, completely agree with what Chief Justice Robinson has indicated. I do think this is a critical time for us to have these conversations. And I agree with him that there's, to me, it's almost an awakening. I think there is a much greater awareness of the need for these conversations. And so I think that is why this is a critical time for us to engage in those discussions, and that this may be different perhaps than other times. The conversation is always critical, it's always important, but I think recent events have led to really, I think I would term it an awakening where individuals, many more individuals are willing to engage in that dialogue. So it has promise in that regard. And
Okay, so since you have both answered the question about why it's important for the conversation on implicit bias and racial justice to take place at this time and now, I'd like to ask you, why do you think that this is a conversation for the judiciary to be leading? And what is the role of judges in, I would call this national debate about implicit bias and racial justice?
This is a really tough question because judges are stepping out of their traditional role. I believe it was the Chief Justice of Louisiana who was one of the first ones to speak up after the Judge Floyd's killing. The reason why I think we need to be involved is because we are required, judges have to see that justice is done. If that's not the case, then people don't believe in our system. And if you think about it, we make these incredible decisions that affect people's lives, and people follow what we ask them to do. Now, that's amazing. We don't have an army, we don't have a police force, we don't have any of those things to enforce our edict. But people in 99% of the cases, I'd say even higher than that, will listen to the court's verdict, and they may grumble a little bit, but they'll do what the court asks them to do. And that's because they believe in the system that we have. There's some people who feel, and I believe rightfully so for some of them, that they aren't getting equal quality of justice. Many years ago, the judicial branch did a study. It was after we had gotten into some hot water about super sealed files. I didn't even know they existed at the time, and found out, lo and behold, they did exist. We ended up with a new Chief Justice, and that Chief Justice was Chase Rogers. And Justice Rogers put together this plan to try to figure out why people were losing confidence in the judiciary. It wasn't just the super secret files. It was people who were losing confidence in the quality of justice. So we did a study, and that study brought in all kinds of stakeholders. It brought in lawyers, it brought in NAACP, it brought in just everyone who had contact with the court system. And we started getting some results that we hadn't expected. And that was that people perceived the quality of justice based on race was different, based on race, based on gender, based on disabilities, based on a whole universe of different things. And we needed to do something about that. So a number of different commissions were created, including the commission that I'm on, which is the Advisory Committee on Cultural Competency. Justice Khan still leads up the Limited English Proficiency Committee. And we started looking into all these things that were going on. Why was the quality of justice perceived as being different? And it was different things such as, I don't feel I'm getting people are getting a fair trial because juries don't look like me. I don't feel that I'm getting a fair shake because judges, for the most part, don't look like me. We needed to start addressing those things. Now, what's the role of the branch? I think the branch is pretty limited compared to other folks, but I think we still do have a part to play. And that is because we are supposed to be the ministers of justice. If that justice is not equal to all those who come before us, and you have to remember, it's not just actual justice, it's also perceived justice. But if you look at some of the things that have been happening, and I'm going to go into one of the things later on in one of the questions, there's reasons for people to perceive that justice is not the same. If you look at what's happening in law enforcement, look at what's happening with the judicial branch, they're not perfect. I think we're very good, and I think we're getting better at it. But should we strive for perfection? Absolutely. You know, I'm a martial artist. I practice karate. I started out as a white belt. I'm now a 4th degree black belt. Am I going to stop now? No, I'm going to keep trying to perfect myself to the day I die. I think the system should also keep trying to perfect itself, you know, as long as this country lasts, because that's the American ideal. This country is really about trying to achieve those ideals that are in the founding documents of this country. Now, we know that when this country started out, it was easy to say all men are created equal, but they weren't treated equally. And by gender, they weren't treated equally. I don't see anything wrong with trying to reach those ideals. And part of those ideals involve what this country's history has been on race and what this country's current practices is that involves race. A lot of folks don't like hearing that. But one of the things I do in my bias trainings is I say, when you see me walking down the street towards you, what do you see? A lot of people are uncomfortable with saying that I see a black man walking down the street. In our bias trainings, we tell people, don't do the I'm colorblind thing. Acknowledge what you see, because that makes a difference in the conversations that you can have. If you deny my blackness, I deny your whiteness, then we're not really acknowledging who we are and how that difference plays a role in our lives. And they do play a difference in our lives. For me, being a black man, race comes up practically every day. I'm often in an environment where I'm the only black person, but race comes to me every day. And it's not, as some people would say, I'm not playing a race card. I don't even like that saying, because if something happens to me, I really think that sometimes race is an issue. Do I know? Sometimes, yes, I do know, because I'm called the N-word. Other times, I don't know. When I walk into a store and a clerk serves a person after I came in and I'm standing there and I become the invisible man, yes, I think that race was a part of that transaction. Something happened there. When I walk into a store, the store detectives tend to follow me around. I often say hi to them just to let them know that I know that they're there. I'm very aware of the movie video cameras in stores and things like that. Race is a part of my life, and I need to have this discussion. And I have this discussion with people at work to let them know that, hey, this is going on in my life. You don't have to deal with this because, and I don't like using the words white privilege. I think that is problematic. But as a white person, you don't have to deal with this. As a white person, you don't have to have that horrible conversation that I had to have with my children about what you have to do to survive a police stop. You know, so race makes a difference in our society, and we need to talk about that.
Thank you.
So You mentioned the bias training that you and Justice Khan do, and we know you've done that among other places among the judiciary. And so we're interested in your experience with individual judges and having difficult conversations with them. And what have you found about their ability to be open about implicit bias? And can you describe what happens when one of those conversations is somewhat successful?
Well, let me start by saying this. I think judges are incredible people. We really want to see justice done. We don't want to think of ourselves as being biased. I mean, think about that. It's like, wait a minute, you're telling me that I'm not treating the people before me fairly. And I'm saying, no, you need to think about whether you're treating them fairly, because then you can start figuring out whether you actually are treating them fairly. I find that most judges are willing to sit down and have conversations about whether we all have biases or not. I can remember when I was a trial judge and doing pretrials, I was a PJ, and an attorney would come in to me and say, hey, I think I'm going to do pretty well. And I would say, why? And he said, because I have an attractive plaintiff. And I go, attractive meaning the case is good? And they said, no, it's a good looking plaintiff. Yes, studies have shown that beautiful people actually end up having better verdicts. Why? It's like, there's something to that. I've practiced it. I've been a judge in places where most of the population was perceived to be in one nationality versus another nationality. And the attorney would come in and say, I'm going to do great because the person's of that nationality. And I would stop them and say, well, wait a minute, are you saying that people of that nationality can't be fair, that they won't perceive your client like they would any other client? What are you saying about our jury system? What are you saying about our jurors? And so bias creeps in every aspect of our lives if we're not careful with it. And judges, I think when you start talking about and start doing the training, they actually are open to it. But you have to remember, judges are just a small reflection of what society is at large. They're incredible people. They're human. And I think we really strive to see that justice is done. But when it comes to these conversations about race, it's a little harder. I do have the conversations about race often. I can remember not all that long ago having a conversation with a judge of the appellate court. And we started talking about race. And the question came up of, we talk about race all the time. What is it? And we both kind of sat there and we went around for quite a bit trying to figure out what race is. When you look at somebody like me, I look sub-Saharan, African. I am part European. I actually am part English, as well as some other things. It was quite a surprise to me to find out that my family owned slaves. And that's a long story to go in some other time. But race is complicated. When somebody looks at like me on this end of the spectrum, somebody looks like you on that end of the spectrum, yeah, you can say white, black. What about somebody who's closer to the middle? I'm at the point now where I think race is not biological. I think race is mostly a social construct, but it's a social construct that has impact on all of us. So I think the more you can bring things to people's conscious mind, the better off they are. I told this story before, I had a situation where a young African-American male came in before me for some kind of crazy teenager kind of crime. And I was about to set bail, and I was going to set a number. And one of the things about being in a GA is the amount of bail you set will have a direct impact on the amount of time a person serves. Study after study comes out and shows that. So I was about to set bail that this young man may not have been able to pay. And we started getting into what his age was. Turned out he was 17. And I ended up appointing a guardian ad litem. And I started to set bail. And I said, well, why am I uncomfortable with this kid? This is not a violent crime. This is sort of a knuckleheaded thing. Why am I uncomfortable with setting bail? And I realized that I come from a nuclear family. And that if I had been in this situation, my mother and father would have been at that courthouse, and I would have been begging the judge, don't let me go. those people are going to get me when I get home. Please keep me away. When I realized that, this young man didn't have anybody with him, and that was sort of setting off my trigger. That was my bias. I had a bias towards nuclear families. So I started asking this kid a question about why his parents weren't there, and it turned out that his parents weren't there because they really didn't know they had to be. They had just pretty much moved to this country. The kid was acting out because he was having problems adjusting. I was able to get the parents in a few days later. Turns out his parents were a lot like my parents, and I was afraid to let him go home with them. So he had such a great support network. And so for many years after that, I was getting cards from the family saying what a great job he was doing. He was, he had eventually went to college and all these incredible things. I could have changed that young man's life for the worse if I had not caught my own biases. And so there you had a sort of an intra-racial bias of me with a nuclear family kind of a thing. And I was able to catch it. So when it comes to race, if we can figure out what our biases are, whether you're biased for or against somebody because of how they look, then I honestly believe this about our society and about our people who are judges and our lawyers. We want to do good. We want to do the right thing. We want to be just. There may be information in our head that we're not quite aware of because it's not quite conscious that is preventing us from doing that. So it's really important that we do this with judges. Justice Khan and I have done this literally all over the country. Our last one was in Idaho. And I told the Idaho judges that, quite frankly, I came out there with my own bias. I expected to see potatoes and nothing more. And it turns out it was a really wonderful, it was in Boise. And it was a really wonderful presentation. My other bias was I looked up and there were elected judges. And so I have, my bias is that appointed judges are more fair. We don't have to worry about elections and things like that. But we will have this wonderful conversation because we put the barriers down. So that's one of the reasons why, that main reason why I think that judges be an important part of this conversation, because we are the ministers of justice. We are out there right in the front where we interact with people. And if we don't do it right, we can destroy people's lives that we shouldn't be destroying. We could be sentencing people for a longer time than we should be, or shorter time than they should be. But we need to make sure that our thought process is conscious and deliberate.
Justice Khan, do you want to add to that? If not, I'm going to ask you a question.
Sure, that would be fine, and I can, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, so you and Justice Robinson have been leading these discussions about implicit bias for quite some time. Actually, I've actually sat in on some of them. So I'd like to ask you, what kind of progress have you seen from your efforts in leading these discussions?
So I would say the answer really depends on how we define progress. We don't have, obviously, a monitoring program where we go back and see how folks are doing or how judges are doing in particular. Maybe we should. I ought to talk to the chief about that, if there was a way to do that. So a lot of our measure of progress really depends on the feedback we get and the interactions we have. So if we were to define progress as acknowledgement or awareness, creating awareness, then I would say we've seen a lot of progress. And so the chief was just talking about some of the training we do, which we do not just for judges, but others. We've done it for bar associations, public defenders, prosecutors, attorney general's office, other bar associations and other bar groups. As people in the legal profession, and particularly judges, they think, we're objective decision makers. And so I make decisions objectively, and we're sort of trained to think that we can put influences aside, but the reality is we're human beings like everyone else, and we're just as prone as everyone else to the same biases, prejudices that everyone else has. And those are formed by our life experience, by societal messages that we receive. And so our training is really geared to get judges and others to become aware that we're all, it's part of the human condition to have these implicit biases. How does our mind work, and how they affect our decision making and the judgments we make without us even being aware of them. And so if we're able to reach our audience that way, and it can be tricky, and we get back that they understand, or that they had a certain awareness that they didn't have before, to us, that's progress. So to give the example of Idaho, the last one we did, there were about 200 judges. 80% of the judges were, well, I think only 10% of the judges were female, white female. They're the lowest ranked in the country. And they had one African-American judge and no one else. And there was a group of 200 judges. They were incredibly gracious, receptive, engaged in really great discussions with us. But to give you an example of how I sort of measure progress, during one of the breaks, one of the judges came up and said, you know, I never knew this, but when I'm dealing with my fellow judges going around the table, I say Judge X, Y, Z, and called them by judge. But when I got to my female colleague, I just called her Tracy, or whatever her first name was. She brought it to my attention. I didn't even realize I was doing that. But now that I'm aware of it, I see other judges doing it. Can you reinforce that message after the break? And so we did. So it's little instances like that. And it's those that are attending the program. Sometimes it's months, a year later, where someone will say, you know, I went to your program and I wasn't really aware of some of the judgments I sometimes make. Now I am more aware. We try to put people at ease. We want to have those very difficult discussions. We like the pushback. And what we typically do is use words like, ouch, if we say something or someone says something to us that you know, we might view differently or take offense. And oops, if we say something that we didn't quite mean it that way. Our program is not about blaming. It's just about understanding the human condition and how we all have biases. It doesn't matter what race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic, background you have. We all have biases, and we also have biases against our own groups that we identify with, because we internalize those biases. So for us, progress is creating the awareness and the acknowledgement. And if we measured it by that, I would say that we are. I'd love to think that we reach 100% of our audience, but if we reach a few people, then that's progress.
Thank you.
So Chief Justice Robinson, a few minutes ago, you referred to the fact that over the decades, there will be an incident often of racial violence, after which there'll be some attention and then a period of silence and people just wishing it would go away. And so we're wondering, what are, in your mind, the barriers to conversations, real conversations about race in white communities, and what can some of those who are with us this evening who will go back to those communities do to make a difference?
Yeah. I can tell you my experience from what people have told me when we start having these conversations, including close friends. And this is part of the difficult part of this conversation. My white friends will tell me, I'm afraid to be called racist if I tell somebody, a black person, how I feel. One of the more innocent things that comes up is, well, do I call black people black or do I call them African American? And I've noticed you use them in a different way. And I explain to them, and that's a wonderful conversation to have. I said, well, the reason why I use them in a different way is because when I talk about a black person, it could mean a Jamaican, a West Indian, a Haitian, an African, a person who was born in Nevada. That to me is a black person. When I talk about African American, I'm talking about my specific nationality. I'm black. I grew up in Connecticut. My wife considers herself to be a Haitian American. Her family's from Haiti. And so often I will say, well, you know what? The best thing you can do is ask the person who you're talking to what, you know, what's your preference? It sounds easy, but that's a difficult conversation. And I can imagine that if I'm trying to have that conversation and I'm a white person, I would be very afraid to have a conversation where I mean well. I'm actually trying to have this conversation. I'm actually trying to be a friend, be an ally, and I want to have this conversation, but I'm so afraid of saying the wrong thing that I'd rather not start the conversation. The other end of that is the Black person receiving that information. And for that person, the problem is, well, if I tell you what I really think, I'm afraid the conversation is going to shut down. And that is a big worry. So it's like both sides of saying, well, let's not talk about race. It's just easier not to deal with that. But remember what I said earlier about our important relationships. If you had a difficult conversation that you had to have with your spouse, you're going to have that conversation. Things may be rocky for a little while around that conversation, but you're going to have that conversation because that relationship is important enough to you. I think we have to really start looking out and saying, these relationships are important enough to us that we need to have these conversations. So I tell my friends and my acquaintances, my coworkers, I want to have this conversation. Are you okay with it? And then I'll tell them, you may be uncomfortable with my answer, or you may be uncomfortable with my question, but please, let's sit down and talk and work it out and get through it. A lot of what I've learned to handle those conversations, quite frankly, I learned from mediating cases. Because the worst thing you can do when you're mediating a case is tell people what they want. It's like, no, listen to them, see what they want, see what they need, and keep going back and forth. It's the dialogue that's important. We need to have that dialogue here. It can no longer continue to be taboo to talk about race, or we're going to keep repeat. It's going to be Groundhog Day. We're going to repeat the same day over and over and over again. And if you remember that movie, when Bill Murray learned his lesson, he went to the next day. We need to learn our lesson and stop repeating this Groundhog Day over and over again.
We've received quite a few questions from people who actually sent them in as part of the registration. And quite a few of the questions have come from lawyers, and they've had a theme. And I'm going to not read the question per se, but I'm going to sort of synthesize what the theme of several of them are. And it is that lawyers are trained to think logically and to look for quote unquote actual evidence. And then several of the questions have then said, well, you look at the murder or the killing of George Floyd, and you see the constant TV replaying, and you hear the news, etc. There seems to be a presumption that there's race and a systemic racism problem. So the question that I think I'm going to ask is, based on these comments, what is the evidence that makes you believe that race or racism is in fact a systemic problem?
Okay. Another tough question. I'd have to start out with my own life's experiences. I know what I've seen, I know what I felt, I know what I've done. Let me give you a specific example of a case I was trying. Actually, it wasn't a case I was trying. I was trying a case in one courtroom, and one of my fellow attorneys was trying a case in another courtroom. My case was courtside, his case was a jury trial. My case was above the fold. I was with the Corporation Counsel's office. It was one of the above the fold, reporters coming in every day reporting about this case. And so it was very nerve-wracking. I recently talked to the fellow attorney who I'm talking about recently, and I said, I miss my old trial days. And he kind of looked at me and says, what do you miss about them? And I said, the excitement of waiting for the jury to come in, arguing for the court. And he said, Rick, you had a migraine every single trial. And he was absolutely right, and I remembered that. So maybe those days weren't so great. But I had finished my trial in courtroom 1. And the way we try to do things in my office is we try to do it tandem as much as we possibly could. And I went in to help him with his trial. He saw me come in the courtroom. I sat down beside him. And I told him, we were going over this witness testifying, and I said, I have a really bad migraine. I'm going to come in tomorrow and help you, but I can't do any more today. And so he writes down on the paper, don't worry about it, I got it. So I left. The verdict came in against us, I think it was over $400,000. So it didn't quite have it. But a few weeks after that, the attorney on the other side called me, and he was very upset. And I thought he was joking. He said, what you did was horrible. And I'm going like, what are you talking about? And he said, this particular jury trial. And I couldn't for the life of me figure out what he was talking about. And finally he said, you trying to influence the juror. And I go, wait a minute, you're accusing me of a crime. Stop and tell me exactly what you're talking about. This person thought that the only reason I walked into the courtroom was to influence one member of the jury who happened to be Black. So somehow me and this Black juror were supposed to mind meld. He was supposed to feel sorry for my client. And that's the reason why I walked in the courtroom. So I could have never walked, and I actually asked the attorney, I said, well, if I were the female attorney in my office, I would have been there to influence the female attorneys. And he said, yes. And so I said, oh, then you were there to influence the white male attorneys, white male jurors. And he said, don't be ridiculous. So he saw race as an issue in a case where it just wasn't. The thing is, I never will know whether a person is doing something to me for racial reasons or for other reasons. When I become the invisible man in that store, is it for race or is it for other reasons? When I got grabbed for shoplifting after I paid for an item was walking out the store, was it for race or was it for other reasons? I'm never quite sure. And then if you look at some things that happen in our systems, whether it's federal or state, and I'd like to share the screen if you don't mind. Now, if you need to enlarge this, at the top of the screen share, you'll see a plus and a minus. You can just click on plus and that'll make it bigger. Now, this is the National Sentencing Commission, which is an organization that's put together. The people are nominated, they're appointed by the President of the United States. And what this does is they look at sentencing and what the sentencing guidelines are doing on the federal level. Now, if you look on the right side, it says key findings. It says Black male offenders continue to receive longer sentences than similarly situated white male offenders. On the very next paragraph, it's non-government sponsored departures and variances appear to contribute significantly to the difference in sentence length between Black males and white male offenders. The next paragraph says violence in an offender criminal history does not appear to account for any of the demographic differences in sentencing. And the very last paragraph says female offenders, all races, receive shorter sentences than white male offenders during post-report report periods. So something is going on here, and it affects race. And if you look at it, they teased out all those other factors that should make a difference. Yet the Black offenders is doing more time than the white offenders. What causes that? I look at that and I say, there's something institutional about it. There's something that the institution is doing that you're coming out with these disparate results when they should be the same. Is that institutional racism? That falls under my definition of institutional racism, or you can call it institutional bias. But something is happening that the system is doing that the outcomes are different based on race or gender. The judiciary that I believe in shouldn't have that anomaly. And I think we need to address things like that, not only as a Black man, but as a Chief Justice of an entire judicial branch. If this is happening, then we should do something about it. Now, I'm going to stop the share here. Now, in Connecticut, you may say, hey, well, that's federal, that's not Connecticut. Remember when I said in 2003, I started doing judicial education? One of the first programs I did was on bias, and it was because we looked at our own numbers. The judicial branch gave the numbers to a professor who crunched all the data, and we knew what the data said. She crunched all the data, and she said, hey, you folks really have a problem that Black offenders are spending more time in than white offenders, even though they have similar backgrounds, similar criminal histories, similar crimes. Blacks are serving more time than whites. Now, what is this? That's how I started to get interested in bias training, because I honestly believe that the judges mean well. I don't believe that judges are racist. I just don't. I think we try to do our best to be fair, but there's something going on that's unfair and it's affecting one population in a very negative way. And even if you look at the statistics after the Alvin Penn law was passed, you'll see that blacks are stopped for pretextual stops at a higher rate than whites. And the interesting thing about that, if you look down into that information, is that blacks will be found less often to have contraband in the car than whites, yet blacks are stopped at a higher rate. So what's causing that? Should we address that? Anybody who I'm going to debate with or discuss this with, I prefer to discuss it with instead of debate it with, I would say, isn't there a problem with this? And don't we want true equality? Should this be happening? If the data says that the blacks that are stopped are found with contraband less often than the whites who are stopped, do you really need to look much further than that to see that there is a problem? And I would say, no, you don't need to look much further than that. Am I saying that police officers are racist? I'm absolutely not saying that. Someone mentioned in something I received not that long ago, be careful in calling 15 million people racist. And I said, I've never done that. Am I saying there's a problem with our systems? Yes, our systems aren't perfect. I'm going to go back to what I said about the founding documents of this country. I do believe that all men and women are created equal, and they should be treated equally by our government institutions. If you did something wrong, you should be punished for it. But you should be punished for what you did, not who you are and how you look. I don't see where that's wrong. I don't see where we're having a hard time with that conversation. I think most people would agree with me if you just stripped it down to that.
To both of you, but perhaps Justice Khan first to you, we see instances of anger and resentment by some white people in reaction, in response to the national movement about racial justice. Do you understand those reactions, and how do you address them?
So, I mean, I guess I don't agree with the reactions, but I understand, I think, what's motivating them. And often I think it's fear, it's a lack of information, it's a lack of understanding everyone's perspective. I think that's where our training on implicit bias is key, because we're very open about our own biases and our own lack of understanding of perhaps someone's perception. So I understand that a lot of it, some of it is intentional racism, of course, but some of it comes just from a complete lack of understanding or experience of what somebody else's life is like. And so I'll use myself as an example in terms of understanding. I don't know what it's like to be a Black person. The only time, and what that's like to experience every day, the only time I think that I can relate or have some empathy is when I am with my friends who are Black and I see how they're treated versus how I'm treated. Another example is when I go shopping with my parents, they don't speak English. I'm in a store, the same stores I frequent when they're not with me. And the treatment that I get is very different. I've noticed that sometimes I'll be followed. Somehow there seem to be a lot more clerks wanting to help me or direct me to the cash registers. And it's these life experiences that inform us. And I think empathy is a great way, not only to have the discussions, but for people to really try to understand the other person's perspective and what it feels like. And so I know what it feels like for me when I was 10 years old when I came to this country. I was my parents' interpreter. And even at that young age, in my early teens, I could see the difference sometimes about how my parents were treated, what they were offered versus somebody else, whether it was a public office, whether it was, the DMV or some other government agency or bank or private entity. And I think when you have those experiences, you begin to understand. And so I know that when it happens even now, I'm angry, and I don't want to call attention to it because I don't want to embarrass my parents, but I walk away from that interaction feeling angry and upset. Um, and so when I have those experiences, I think they help me to understand, although I don't know and would never suggest that I know what it's like to be a Black person. And I think a lot of what comes from this anger and resentment is a lack of understanding. The chief mentioned the example of a training we did where a young man said, well, what do you've made it, you're a chief justice. And I recognize I'm very fortunate to have the position I have. But when we take off our robes and we go into the community, you know, I don't identify myself as a justice. The chief doesn't either. He becomes a Black man in the community. And so I think it's interesting, but I think that the only way to lessen that anger and resentment is to have these very difficult, meaningful discussions, but people have to be willing to engage in them, and they have to be willing to accept that acceptance of implicit unconscious bias is the first step. And until you have that, you can't engage in that meaningful discussion. So to address the part of your question about how do we address that anger, I think it's trying to engage in those discussions and being open and frank and bringing people into being willing to listen and engage. So I hope I've answered your question on that.
Thank you.
If I'd like to step in on this one too, if you don't mind. I would be really ticked off if somebody called me a racist. I really would. I'd be really ticked off if I thought someone was calling me a racist. I would get angry. That's one of the reasons why these conversations are so difficult. There's nuances to this that I think people don't understand. You sort of go to the shortcut. And we as human beings, we love shortcuts. That's how we deal with a lot of information. You know, this country, we like to think of it as a meritocracy. People should earn what they get in life. And that's great. And I actually agree with that. The problem is if the system has taught you, if you've learned through your entire life that one group of people is looking for something that they haven't worked for, then you're going to get angry at that group of people. This goes back to the implicit bias thing. Even if you constantly reject some of those notions, that you constantly say that, no, I don't believe all Blacks are this way. I don't believe that, in the Black welfare queen, all these other things that you've heard your entire life. The question is, what is your unconscious mind doing with that same information? And if it's doing something with information you don't know about, you're going to end up with a result that you sort of justify yourself, but it's not a fair result. And so I do understand when a lot of folks react negatively to having this conversation on race, because it's a tough conversation and it's based on some things. It's based on some things that were baked into the system. If you look at how the middle class was created after World War II, a lot of those programs that created the middle class, whether it was housing loans, whether it was the GI Bill, whether it was a farming loan, my grandfather couldn't get farming loans. My grandfather had a situation where, you want to talk about absurd, he would drive my mother and my aunts and uncles in the town, and they would watch German prisoners of war drinking from a whites-only water fountain that they would be killed for drinking from. That's a pretty absurd situation, especially when some of my uncles actually served in military. So you had this middle class being built up. At the same time, we were nowhere near as advanced as we are as far as race relations. Yet these systems built this middle class, built these housing patterns we have today. That's still impacting upon us. So people kind of do this thing where, well, that was 50 years ago, and that was 70 years ago. Those systems still operated to create an unfairness in our society that impacts us today. So when you start saying that people didn't merit what they're doing, they're looking for something that they didn't earn, I actually understand them saying that. But let's have the conversation about why that isn't true. Let's have the conversation. Let's read. One of the things I'll do often is, hey, read this book. I think this is great. There's a book, the title is Color of Law, which I think is a fantastic book to help you understand what created some of the housing patterns we have today. People tend to jump to this conclusion that blacks live in the black area, whites live in the white area because they prefer to be with blacks, they prefer to be with whites. Not so much. The housing patterns were created through redlining and things of that nature. So it's a lot more complicated than just black and white.
Thank you.
Well, we've got a lot of questions, and systemic racism is one of the leading questions, and in the criminal justice system in particular. So I am looking at a question that really focuses on what we're going to call the racism in this justice system from the cradle to the prison. So the question is, there is systemic racism in the criminal justice system from the stopping, from policing to charging decisions by prosecutors, by either giving bond or not releasing on bond, and then you've already talked about the sentencing. So the question goes, can you tell us what the judicial branch is doing to address this societal problem? That's the first part of this question. The second is there an official policy or mission of the branch as it relates to race and ethnicity? The third part of this question is, does the branch see itself as having a role in disparate outcomes and inequitable treatment in the criminal justice system? If not, why not? If so, what can the branch do better? I'm going to direct this to Chief Justice Robinson first.
You're muted.
I'm going to need you to remind me of the different parts of this question. But I'm going to start out by saying this. We started after the strategic plan was made, and we started to operate in ways that we started to address some of these things. Some of it was like whether people had equal physical access to the courthouse. And so we started addressing that. ADA, Justice Khan's LEP committee, which is the Limited English Proficiency Committee. We started looking at the barriers for people coming in court. I mean, think about it. You come in court, whether you could even be a bystander, you're sitting in the courtroom, you're listening to the proceedings, and you don't really understand what's happening. Should you have an interpreter? Should somebody be able to hear what is actually going on? We decided to address those issues. Implicit bias. Not only do we train the judges, we do programs for the judges on implicit bias. Many of you have gone to some of the programs we've done. We've gone to the Connecticut Bar Association. We've gone to the various local bar associations. We've even gone to trainings, training the prosecutors, the public defenders, judges of other states, because we honestly believe that the way to deal with this is to make sure that every stakeholder, every person who touches the branch actually understands what could be happening as far as implicit bias is concerned. The probation officers do training. One of the best trainings I think we ever did was with the state's attorney's office. We did one for the AG's office. The state's attorney's office, I will admit when I have a bias to a group, because I think that actually helps them connect and feel okay about, hey, it's okay to explore my biases. But those of you who've seen the program, there was one time we used to show this movie, and in the movie, there was a homeless man and a rather wealthy looking white woman, and they're interacting. And then I start asking questions about what do people think about these two people in this short movie clip. And you actually don't know much about these two people at all. You really don't even know if the guy's homeless or the woman is actually wealthy. Although when they had the old trip boards at the Grand Central Station, and it mentioned Westchester and White Plains and Stamford and places like that. So I got teased at one presentation, said, well, we know she lived on the Gold Coast. But when I asked the prosecutors, I said, what did you think about him? There was a scene where he's eating a lunch, and it looked like he might have taken it. It was a salad, actually. It looked like he might have taken her salad. And I was expecting the state's attorneys to say exactly that. Instead, they said, No, no, there was no evidence of that whatsoever. You know, I could speculate. That group of people I really thought would have a bias toward the guy committed that horrible act, committed a crime. So I admitted my bias to them. And I think that actually helped them sort of free up when they realized that this wasn't about lecturing people. This is about trying to open doors, open pathways for people to think about things in a different way. How the decisions that you make unconsciously may influence your conscious decision-making process. So the branch is doing a lot of training. We require judges to go through training 3 times a year, actually. It's the CJI, which is Connecticut Judicial Institute, spring training and fall training. We make sure that we deal with things that you normally don't have to attend, things like implicit bias training, like diversity, like psychiatry, psychology and psychiatry. How does the brain work the way it does? How does the juvenile brain develop? So if we do all these other things about how the brain develops and people are okay with that, why are they a little uneasy about training about race? It's like, it's a really interesting thing. We don't want to touch it. That's the third rail. So we have to get away from that. I've done bias trainings for police officers. I try to do trainings for every single contact the branch has, because I think that in order to really get equality and justice, you have to start at the beginning of the pipeline. We are just the end of the pipeline. And I honestly feel that it's my responsibility, not just as Chief Justice, my responsibility as a judge to do that.
So, Chief Justice Robinson, you have established a task force to look at racial bias in the selection of juries. What can you tell us why and what you hope to accomplish with that?
Yes, there was a trilogy of cases that was decided, all involving race. One was the jury array not being comprised of what the attorney for the defendant said was the makeup of the group in, I think it was New London. The other one was this case, Holmes. And in Holmes, it dealt with Batson. And those of you who had to deal with Batson know that Batson's a sort of an interesting case. Its principles sound wonderful, that people are entitled to a jury of their peers, and that includes people who look like them. The problem with Batson, though, is no one wants to call an attorney who is picking a jury a racist. And often, most often, they are not. And so how is a judge going to sit there and say, counsel, give me a non-racial reason for the reason you struck that person? And the attorney's going to do it. Now, if you look at the cases all around the country, you start seeing some pretty bizarre reasoning that they do it, including things like that person had blue shoes and I don't like blue shoes. That's sort of an extreme, but you start seeing things like on a jury, well, that person's education level wasn't as high as I think it should be. And then you start looking at the jury forms and it's like, that person's education level is as high as everybody else's. So I'm not sure about that. But you don't want to call somebody a racist. And as I said, I don't think that they are, but something's going on. The other thing about Holmes that was really interesting is you have this man who was a social worker. He had family members who had difficulties in contact with the police. He had issues himself where he's had some negative experience with police officers, said he could be fair, and then he's stricken from the jury. What does that mean for any Black person who grew up in an urban area? That pretty much means that I've had negative experiences. I was ordered to go full felony prone. I've been pulled over and the police officer didn't explain the reason or said, you made furtive movements. That's just not fair. It will eliminate an entire segment of the population, Blacks who live in urban areas. So I looked at this and I said, this can't be right. But I don't have all the answers. So I put together a jury task force. And one of the things I made sure, I tried to make sure that people with different points of view, different mindsets are on this task force. That makes their job a lot tougher because it'd be easier to put everybody on there who thinks exactly the same. I didn't want to do that. I made sure there were public defenders, there were state's attorneys, there were plaintiffs' lawyers, there were defense lawyers. I tried to make sure I had the most well-rounded team of rivals that I could possibly have, because I was hoping and am hoping that because all those folks are together with different ideas, that they'll be able to talk with each other, communicate. And I had a meeting with them yesterday, and I asked them to do this. Please talk to each other, communicate with each other. Don't walk away from the table if you're triggered by something. I need you to stay involved, interact, and really get the job done. Because if we do this right, we will come up with a more fair judicial system. And I think that's what everybody wants.
I can't resist this. Your Honor, you just referred to Babson, and Joe will appreciate the comment that I'm getting ready to make. I'm not, I'm supposed to be a moderator, so but I'm gonna step out of my lane. I often do that. I started out by giving the Judge Motley's bio, and I said that she argued 10 cases before the Supreme Court in 110. I'm actually gonna say something. If Judge Motley was here, she'd tell you herself. She won 9 at the time, but when Babson was decided, she won her 10th. So I just had to throw that in for all of those who are keeping track. Judge Motley won 9 cases. The 1 case that she lost was on jury selection. But when the Supreme Court decided Babson, she wrote in her autobiography that the Supreme Court finally got it right, and she won her 10th. Having said that, lawyers are making up probably a large percentage of this audience of somewhere between 500 and 600 people on this call tonight. So what is the role of lawyers and the legal system in addressing issues that we're talking about tonight, systemic and structural racism? And I'm going to refer this case to Judge Kahn first.
Thank you, Professor Ford. I actually think that lawyers play a vital role in addressing systemic and structural racism and bias wherever it exists, whether it's within the court system, outside the court system, in private practice, in public institutions. I think they play a key role. You know, I'm not going to repeat what Attorney Schwartz, in his introduction to this program today, he mentioned the preamble and the first lines of the section, the preamble on lawyers' responsibility. Very appropriate on this issue. And I'm going to end with the last few lines of that same section of the preamble, ends with, lawyers play a vital role in the preservation of society. It's very broad. And I think that lawyers and the legal profession, we are tasked with defending and protecting the rule of law in our legal institutions. And if we don't act in ways that promote those institutions to be fair and equitable, then we lose the public trust. And if we lose the public trust in our legal system and its fair application of the laws, then we've lost our society and we've lost our profession. And I think lawyers, it's incumbent on every lawyer, whether they're litigators or not, whether they do civil or criminal, whether they do housing, whether they're involved with legislation, whatever field they're working in, whatever institutions they're working with, that if they have that awareness of how unconscious bias and implicit bias may affect folks of color and other minority groups, if they work to create the awareness and tools to even the playing field and to make our laws apply more justly and more fairly, I think is critical. And I think it's incumbent on all of us, not just in our professional lives, but even also in our personal lives, how we conduct ourselves in our communities.
So we have a follow-up question on the role of the profession, but I do, like Professor Ford, want to step out of my lane for a moment just to acknowledge the many excellent questions and comments coming into us on the chat line from the attendees. I don't think we're going to be able to get to your questions, but they are being recorded. They'll be saved. They'll be shared, of course, with the justices and be available for the continuation of this series. But I will mention that several of them relate to the statutes and the laws that judges are obligated to administer, and just point out to everybody that the legislature has a special session starting a week from Monday, and Judiciary Committee is holding a hearing on that 65-page bill a week from this Friday. And so that is an opportunity for everyone in the state of Connecticut to have some influence over the laws themselves that the judiciary is obligated to administer. And so with that, back to the questions, and this is to both of you. That we are all aware of the underrepresentation of African Americans and other lawyers of color in the legal profession, especially at the higher levels of equity partner in large law firms. What kinds of pipeline programs and other programs can make a difference in broadening and the diversity of the profession?
I'd like to start answering that, Dean Fisher. Look at some of the things even that our local bars, or Connecticut Bar. We have programs that are dealing with this exact problem that you have. The first issue is hiring lawyers of color. Then the issue becomes retaining lawyers of color. The firms that are telling me that, hey, we're actually having less of a problem hiring, but we're having more of a problem retaining. And those lawyers are actually speaking up at some of the bar events that we have. And so I would advise those firms who feel that they have those problems that they really attend those events, because then they can hear from the people who are actually involved in the system why I'm not happy staying at this firm. One lawyer jokingly said to me, we're tired of training people and then they end up with the state's attorney's office or the AG's office. And I said, well, there's a reason for that, and you should look at it. But one of the problems I think we have with pipelines is we don't create them early enough. We don't bring in the younger people. I remember going to a mock trial that the University of Connecticut School of Law had for young people. And that's what we need to start doing. We need to start getting people earlier and earlier. And there's some wonderful programs. My clerk is part of Civics First. And he really devotes a lot of time to that program, because that starts reaching out and getting people before they're in college. If you start talking to someone about going to law school while they're in college, I think that's a little late to be talking to them. You need to start earlier in the process. For attorneys of color, you need to start going out there and meeting these kids. You'd be surprised how many times they bring a class to the Supreme Court for a tour, and the young people look up and they see the oil paintings and they say, there's no black people. There's been a couple of times where External Affairs had said, hey, look, this just happened again. Do you have time to come down? And I just run down there and they say, ladies and gentlemen, the Chief Justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court. And the kids are like, whoa. And Dean Fisher, it's not just the black children, it's the white children too. They look and they say, whoa, this doesn't fit the pattern that I've learned. There's something different about this. I think that our hope is in our young people. Hope is in our children. We have to take care of the older folks too. But when we start talking about pipelines, you members of the Connecticut Bar Association, please get out there and talk to the younger people. I did a presentation very recently at an elementary school in Stratford that was named after Miss Soto, who was killed in the Newtown shooting. And they were like first graders. And sure, I couldn't talk to them about, the rules against perpetuities, but I could tell them, hey, look, yeah, I'm a judge and I wear this black robe, and the reason why I wear this robe, and they were all fascinated by it. So if you look at what's going on in our society, we are training kids to pass tests. There's less civics taught, there's less history taught. Quite frankly, even when I was learning history, not enough of actual history was taught. People like me were left out of it, except for, there was slavery and then there's now. I mean, that's pretty much how my history was taught to me. So we need to make sure that we have programs like Civic First, like we're building these pipelines, because, and I think you'll agree with me on this, Dean Fisher, if UConn and Quinnipiac and Yale and Harvard are going to continue to have this robust and even more diverse group of people coming to the law schools, we need to catch these children much earlier in the process. And I thank UConn for doing exactly that with that program. But we need to do more of that. Lawyers Collaborative for Diversity actually has a program where they have young people come and work in law firms for the summer. And that is an excellent program. And quite frankly, when the kids argue, I've seen some of them as good as some of the attorneys who are listening to this program. It's like shockingly how good they are. But it's simple things like that. We tend to be on autopilot as a society. We need to stop that. We need to really start looking. And as lawyers, we have a special obligation. I've said in speeches many times that the rule of law and the law is the fabric of our society. And we have the legal, moral, ethical obligation to make sure that that cloth, whenever it tears, that it's mended. Because once the law falls apart, once the rule of law falls apart, society falls apart. That saying in the Shakespeare play, first we kill all the lawyers. The reason why that was uttered is not that people hated lawyers, is that if you want to break down society, the very first thing you have to do is kill the lawyers. That's the important role that we have.
Justice Khan, a follow-up question to that, along the lines of making that kind of progress in the profession. We hear often, including from women lawyers and lawyers of color, of experiencing an imposter syndrome as they enter the profession. Have you talked with junior lawyers about how to manage that experience?
That's a great question. Yes, I have. I am not an expert on imposter syndrome, other than I have myself experienced it. And I have attended a program actually recently at Fordham Law School on just imposter syndrome. So you could spend an entire program talking about it and its impact. But for those on this program who are not aware of what it means, the imposter syndrome it's really a psychological pattern of where a person doubts their own accomplishments. And so it's a persistent internalized fear of not being good enough or being exposed as a fraud. It tends to, originally was identified when studying women who were very highly successful women, but more recent studies show that both men and women experience it. And basically, the way, and I'm sure perhaps many of our attendees have experienced this, it comes after getting a job or finishing a degree or a promotion. Someone feels that they didn't really deserve it, and they got it either because of luck or deception. Despite external evidence of competence, someone still feels that. It's particularly impactful on women, and particularly women of color. It's a double whammy because the syndrome is exacerbated when someone is exposed to an unconscious bias or comment or an environment that perpetuates that syndrome. And I'll give you an example where it's happened to me. And it's happened to some of my friends, my colleagues, where someone will say, wow, how did you get that job? I once was asked by a friend, it's no secret I was very fortunate to have a very quick elevation from the appellate to the Supreme Court. And I was asked by someone to help them a colleague in their quest for elevation. And as I'm explaining the process, the person said to me, well, you had something more to offer. Now I was shocked and I didn't know how to respond at the moment. And of course I knew what the person meant. And normally now in my training, a tool I'll use is to say to folks, just pause and say, gee, that's interesting. Why would you say that? Make the person articulate what they meant. But what that does, that comment I internalize is you think I was only elevated because of my status or my background or my ethnicity. Now, I don't deny it. I'm very fortunate and very blessed. And I recognize that my ethnicity and my diversity has helped me. I wouldn't suggest that it doesn't. But I'd also like to think that I'm competent and qualified for the job. And so it's those types of interactions that particularly women, and certainly women of color experience that exacerbate that imposter syndrome. But everyone experiences it, men and women equally, but certainly, you know, lawyers of color and you know, other disfranchised groups and minority groups and women experience it at a much greater rate. And one of the things I say to help folks manage it, I wish I had the perfect cure, I don't. But one of the things I would say is pause and ask a question in a non-threatening way. Just say, that's interesting. What did you mean by that? And the person has to step back and try to articulate what it is that they just meant by that comment. So that's just one tool.
Yes,
Actually, sometimes the person may be alluding to affirmative action. So I am going to ask a follow-up question. We hear opposition to affirmative action in some quarters from time to time. So I'm going to ask you if you could explain what you understand that term affirmative action to mean, and why you believe there is some opposition to affirmative action. And I think I'm going to ask Chief Justice Robinson to address this first.
Okay. Remember earlier when I talked about a meritocracy? We like to believe that people earn their positions, people work for it. When race starts to come in, a very strange thing starts to happen. And let me give you an example. When I was nominated when my nomination was announced for the Supreme Court by Governor Motley, we had a press conference. And I was at this press conference, and you know, it was a wonderful event. And the reporter started asking questions about me. And one of the questions that he asked Governor Motley was, Justice Norcott is an African American. Judge Robinson is an African American. Did that have anything to do with him being appointed? I don't think you'd ever get that kind of question with a white male replacing a white male. It comes up when you're black or you're a female. Governor Motley looked at him, and I remember smiling because he looked at me and he said, Judge Robinson, isn't today your birthday? I had this sort of a weird coincidence that whenever I was elevated, it had something to do with my birthday. Always a coincidence, but it was an amazing coincidence. And I said, yes. And he said, happy birthday. Then he said, how long have I known you? And I said, well, we met in 1971. And it was at West Hill High School. You were upperclassmen, and I was a freshman, first class to matriculate through the school. And he said, yeah, and then you went off to school, and I went off to school, and then we met again. And I was a member of the Board of Finance of the City of Stamford, and you were the attorney for the Board of Finance. And I said, yes. And he said, how many years did you represent the board then? I said, about 4 years, I think it was. And he said, I went back into private practice. Well, he's already in private practice, but I eventually ran for mayor, and I became the mayor. And how long did you work with me when I was mayor? And I said, I think it was about 6 of the 8 years, or I think it was 8 years that he was mayor. But I had left to become a judge. And then he looked at the report and said, I've known this man longer than any of my other appointments. Why would you ask that question? And to me, that was the perfect answer. If anything, I became a Supreme Court justice because Governor Motley by then knew my history, and we had worked together. In worst case scenario, he just knew me, but it wasn't that I was black. Now, as Justice Khan said, was that any part of that his thinking when he nominated me to be justice? And he said himself that he was looking for some diversity on the court. But why did that become the issue for quite a few folks? If you look at the comment sections of newspaper articles when I was nominated, you'll see that people saying he was nominated because he's black. He nominated because he's black, nominated because he's black. And it's like, that can lead to this imposter syndrome that Justice Khan is talking about. And that can lead to people who think about affirmative action, that affirmative action is putting a black person in a white person's job, and that is affirmative action. The problem I have with that is, to me, affirmative action is something totally different. Affirmative action means to look at your system, your processes, and see if there's something going on with that that is affecting a certain group of people in a negative way. And if there is something like that, then you need to address it. Not diversity for the sake of diversity, but I do think that diversity actually does help. Coming from different places, different experiences. It's like I said about my jury task force. You put those people together and they come up with a whole different idea than they would have if they had been one homogenous group. So for me, affirmative action is to actively look at what's going on in your system, whether it's your law firm, whether it's the judicial branch, whether it's the state of Connecticut, whether it's the United States. You look at what's going on internally in your systems that are having negative effects on certain groups of people, and then figure out why that's happening and how to fix it. And quite frankly, I think that helps law firms, it helps courts to come up with a better way of thinking about things.
So I believe this is going to be my last question before Professor Ford has a final, but and I'm going to go off script if you'll permit me. Forgive me, Chief Justice Robinson, because the chat line has raised a number of very interesting questions about administration of justice in the state courts in Connecticut. And you've already addressed the importance of improving the racial equality in jury selection. Are there other areas of judicial administration that you might turn your attention to, for example, with regard to sentencing disparities, bail disparities, issuance of failures to appear, and the like?
Great question. The Chief Court Administrator and I have been talking about all of this. And the thing about these tragedies, whether it's the George Floyd killing or COVID-19, this gives us opportunities to really look and make changes that we need to make. One of the things that we believe is that technology actually is going to help us a lot. If you look at the people who can least afford to take a day off to come to court, whether it's for a traffic infraction or a misdemeanor, there's a lot of contacts with the court system. Sometimes cases are resolved 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, or 5 times. The person has to come from their job and go to the court system to work something out with a prosecutor. That's when the FTA started occurring. In these misdemeanor FTAs, we have 42,000 pending active FTAs, misdemeanors, 42,000. And a lot of those are after a numerous amount of court appearances. If we can reduce the court appearances, including the initial court appearance, I think that will help people, not only people of color, but people who live from paycheck to paycheck to keep their jobs, to be able to feed their families. We have an opportunity here to look at the system from the bottom up and look at those kind of inequities and look at how we've been doing things for decades just because that's the way we've been doing it. We now have a system where if you have an infraction, you can actually negotiate online with a prosecutor. So you don't even have to make that first court appearance. You can say, I was going faster than 55, but I wasn't doing 70. I'll pay this much. Prosecutor may accept it, may not. If he accepts it, over. We're looking at whether we can do more things even with misdemeanor appearances to reduce the number of time a person has to have contact with the court system. So yes, we're looking at the entire system from the bottom up to weed out not just the issues of bias, but the inequities in the system. Because there is this problem with people who have the means to obtain justice and people who don't have the means to obtain justice. And this is the perfect opportunity to look at that.
I think I have the pleasure of asking the last question, and I'm going to go off script a little bit. We started this with me actually talking about Judge Constance Baker Motley being a trailblazer in the legal profession, fighting to dismantle all the systems of racial inequality and disparate treatment of people generally. So I would say that in her lifetime, what Judge Constance Baker Motley did certainly was to answer the call to action. So the last question I'm going to ask came in from various individuals, and I'm going to frame this as the call to action. They did not. This is me rephrasing the question. So if someone in the listening audience of over 500 or 600 people, however many we have on this call tonight, were to ask you what concrete steps can they take to address the issues that we're discussing tonight? What would you tell them? What would be the advice if someone were asking, I would like to answer the call to action? Justice Khan, would you like to go first?
Certainly. Wow, it's a great question. It's a long list. So I would say, as I said earlier, I think those of us in the legal profession, whether you're a lawyer, a judge, whether you practice law in the traditional sense or not, we all have an obligation. And that your involvement can come whether you participate in Civics First, whether you go to schools and you mentor young children and you talk to them about the law and about opportunities in their careers. So that's one aspect in your communities in education. Another would be, I hope that most people attending this program, I imagine, are aware. Many, I imagine, may have encountered some of the experiences that we've talked about. And so the key would be to create awareness so that the dialogue continues. But more importantly, I hope that we have empowered individuals to go forward and feel comfortable talking about these issues. And if they want to say, look, if the Chief Justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court and other justices in the branch is willing to engage in those discussions, then we should as well, whether that's professors in law schools or students in law schools. But awareness and a willingness to engage in those discussions and to really listen to each other and to try to create understanding and empathy would be the message and the takeaway that I hope folks would have, and try to understand how this impacts someone's life on a daily basis so that we can make a more fair and just society, not just in reality, but also in perception.
Justice Robinson, your response to the call to action?
Thank you. Well, I'm gonna call Justice Khan out on this. We were discussing, you know, this moment, and both of us had to admit we're really, really nervous. It is much easier to talk about appellate procedure than it is to talk about race. This is really hard to do. Yet we feel it's important enough that we need to do it. In part because of our personal relationship with each other. We're actually very close, and we've traveled together and things of that nature with our families. And it's important enough for our relationship that we go to those uncomfortable regions. And you have to be willing to be uncomfortable. And you have to be willing to accept information that's uncomfortable. If I'm at all right about the reason why some white people don't want to have this conversation, then those others of us need to really work harder at letting them know that we can have this conversation. We might not agree with you. If you're going to have a conversation, it's going to be from the heart. You have to understand, you might hear some things that you're not going to want to hear. But if the relationship is important enough to you, then let's have that conversation. You know, it's interesting that the most segregated day of the week is Saturday and Sunday. We go to our mutual homes and we have nothing to do with the other side, or we worship. And it's like, you know what? My household is a little bit different from that. You know, my household, I have people in all the time who don't look like me. I try to have people in my home who don't think like me. I try to get, diversity is not the right word, but I try to past those barriers that keep us apart. And my life has been more fulfilled because of it. So the first thing I can say that really, really help is to start having these difficult conversations. And race, despite the fact that I don't know what it is an important part of our lives. And if you're talking to a person who, because of their life experience, they think about race more often, try not to think of it as a race card, but as a life experience. As I said earlier, I don't know sometimes, a lot of the times, when a person is doing something at me because of my race. I can tell you that it bothers me when people perceive me one way, when they see me in the court parking lot or when they see me on the street, and another way when they see me in a black robe. I'm the same person. I may not be able to talk about the same things, but I'm the same person. But there's often times when I am reminded that I am Black when I'm not wearing that robe. Even when I'm in the court building sometimes, I will tell you that a marshal or two has treated me poorly, and I suspected that was the problem. They didn't know who I was. I had one who actually looked at my badge and still couldn't figure out that it was a red badge, which meant I was a judge or a justice, and proceeded to keep making mistakes and putting his foot in his mouth. That was not a wonderful experience for me. And that person probably has forgotten this. I'm still carrying that baggage. That event still bothers me to the point where I talked to Pat Carroll and said, hey, look, we need to make sure that the marshals don't treat people this way. This is just wrong. The only reason why this person wouldn't have treated me this way is if they had known that I was a justice or a judge. That's not right. That's not right. So yeah, that's my biggest point, that you need to have this conversation. It's going to be an uncomfortable conversation. If you want to, set out the parameters of that conversation with the person. I want to talk about this. If it gets too rough, I want to back off for a while and we'll continue the discussion later. But have the courage to have that conversation, because I think that's where it starts.
Thank you, Jan.
Well, thank you both so much, Chief Justice Robinson, Justice Khan. This has been a wonderful and remarkable conversation and education for all of us, myself included. We are really pleased that we were able to use this evening's program to kick off our Constance Baker Motley speaker series. I want to repeat my tremendous gratitude to you, Professor Ford, for an extraordinary introduction to Judge Motley and her life, and to Joel Motley and your entire family, Mr. Motley, for the wonderful example that she sets for all of us of what justice can accomplish. And so now, to close out the event, we ask Cecil, Justice Robinson, you had
yes, but I'd like to do what you and Professor Ford did and go off script for a second. I know that your days of being Dean of University of Connecticut School of Law are winding down. I just want to thank you for being a fantastic partner with the judicial branch. You've helped in ways that most people will never know. And the branch is a better place for it. The state is a better place for it. And I wish you well in your future endeavors.
Well, thank you. And the school will be in wonderful hands starting 18 days from now with Judge Ebony Nelson, and I know she will continue this wonderful relationship. So, not only with the judiciary, but also with the Connecticut Bar Foundation and the Connecticut Bar Association, whose president-elect Cecil Thomas is now going to say a few concluding remarks and details about the next event in this series. Cecil Thomas.
Thank you, Dean Fisher. I want to take a few minutes in closing to thank our speakers, our moderators, our organizers, and our participants. Chief Justice Robinson, Justice Khan, Dean Fisher, and Dr. Ford, thank you. Yours have been powerful and important voices in the advancement of racial equality, diversity, and inclusion in our profession and in our world long before this evening, and will continue to be as we move forward. Thank you for your leadership and the strength of your teaching tonight. The response to this event and the scope of its undertaking is a testament to the power of collaboration. This is a joint effort, as we mentioned earlier, of the Connecticut Bar Association and the Connecticut Bar Foundation. I want to thank the many individuals involved in its production, including Natalie Wagner and her team at the Connecticut Bar Foundation and Keith Ceresi and his team at the Connecticut Bar Association. I also want to acknowledge and thank the steering committees from the Connecticut Bar Association Diversity Inclusion Committee and the Connecticut Bar Foundation James W. Cooper Fellows that are working with great care to produce this series. This marks the beginning of a journey that I hope we will take together towards a clearer understanding of the world immediately around us and a more just and equitable society. Our next session in the series will take place on August 12th at 2 p.m. and will highlight the history and present impact of housing segregation in Connecticut. You will learn from experts in the history of fair housing in Connecticut, as well as people of color who lived in communities in Connecticut that were effectively erased by urban renewal efforts. You will also learn about the impact of housing segregation on opportunity and mobility through the lens of opportunity mapping. Please join us on August 12th for the next session in this important series. Additional planned sessions will cover topics such as voter suppression, education, and the legacy of Sheff versus O'Neill, racial disparities in healthcare access and health outcomes, structural racism in consumer finance and lending, the zoning and affordable housing laws that maintain segregated communities, among other important manifestations of structural racism in our society. Each of these sessions will include presentations of relevant history and data, present impact, strategic recommendations for action, and the opportunity for questions and discussion. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We were taught by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that the arc of the moral universe is long, but that it bends towards justice. That arc has always been bent by the likes of those gathered here this evening. Again, thank you for joining us. I look forward to seeing you at our next session on August 12th. I wish you all a good night.